and welcome, and thank you to everyone for coming to Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice. This event is hosted by Center for Inquiry Canada, your community for science and secularism. My name is Shauna Watson. I'm Vice President of CFIC, and I'll be your host for this talk. CFIC is Canada's only national nonprofit with the mission of promoting and educating the public on critical thinking, science, and secularism. We work to equip people to make decisions based on evidence, rational thinking, and compassion. To that end, we hold events like this to provide an opportunity for you to engage with subject matter experts on a variety of topics. These days of physical distancing, CFIC's events and activities are provided online, available from coast to coast to coast. We rely entirely on donations and memberships to allow us to bring you events such as this. Please visit our website, centerforinquiry.ca, or email info@centerforinquiry.ca for more information if you're interested in becoming a member or making a donation. We'll be recording this talk and we'll be publishing it on CFIC's YouTube channel. We will include the Q&A session. If you don't want your name or image to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera and change your screen name. To minimize background noise, we ask everybody to mute their microphone. If you have problems with audio or video, I suggest you turn off your video. That sometimes improves things. After the talk, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. The questions will be asked by text, so we'll use the Zoom chat window to submit your question, and I will be posing the questions to our speaker. Now, I'd like to introduce everyone to our guest speaker. Gregg Caruso is Professor of Philosophy at SUNY Corning and Honorary Professor of Philosophy at Macquarie University. Gregg is also the co-director of the Justice Without Retribution Network at the University of Aberdeen School of Law. His research interests include free will, moral responsibility, punishment, philosophy of law, moral psychology, and public policy. Gregg's books include Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice, Just Desserts, Debating Free Will with Daniel Dennett, Free Will and Consciousness, a Determinist Account of the Illusion of Free Will. Now, it's my understanding, Gregg, that the two new books are just on the point of coming out and may not be available everywhere. But if you visit Gregg's website, which Gus will be posting the links in the chat, you'll be able to find more information. So now I'd like to turn everybody over to the presentation by Gregg. Welcome, Gregg.
Yes, thank you for having me. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my PowerPoint screen so that everyone could follow along. And then my presentation will roughly be about 45 minutes. And after that, we'll leave sufficient time for questions and answers. So let me see if I could share my screen here. Does that work for everybody? Thumbs up, yeah. Okay, so my talk today is on the topic of my new book, which is the same title as the talk, Rejecting Retributivism, Free Will, Punishment, and Criminal Justice. The outline of my talk is that I'm going to start by just briefly explaining to you what the retributive justification for legal punishment is. Some of you probably have an intuitive idea of what retribution is about, but I want to bring out certain salient features of the retributive justification of punishment because it's relevant to what I'll argue later. Then I'm going to explain my reasons for rejecting retributivism. So in the book, I developed 6 distinct arguments for rejecting retributivism. I'm not going to be able to go into detail, of course, with all 6. And so in this talk, I'm kind of giving you a big picture of the overall argument, but I'll briefly mention the 6 arguments if I have time. And then I'm going to turn to my alternative, and I'm going to outline my alternative to retributive punishment, which I call the public health quarantine model. And then I'll end by taking time for questions and answers. So the book is essentially broken down into 2 main halves. The first half lays out 6 distinct arguments against retributivism. There's a transitional chapter where I look at alternatives, what are called consequentialist theories of punishment, deterrence theories, mixed accounts. I'm not going to discuss that chapter today. And then the second half of the book is developing my non-retributive alternative, But I also view this alternative as a non-punitive alternative, i.e. one that's not a justification of punishment, but an alternative to punishment. Okay, so let me just start with some definitions. I want to give you a kind of very precise, philosophers are into their precise definitions. I want to give you a definition of what I mean by legal punishment. So legal punishment consists in one person deliberately harming another on behalf of the state in a way that's intended to constitute a fitting response to some offense and to give expression to the state's disapproval of that offense. We have an intuitive notion of punishment, like when a parent punishes a child or a university punishes a student by expelling them for plagiarism. But legal punishment is a kind of specific type of punishment. It's carried out by the state, and usually it satisfies the following sort of 5 conditions. So person A legally punishes person B, sort of on behalf of the state, if and only if, 1, he harms the punishee. Punishment includes some form of harm, some form of a deprivation of liberty or reduction in well-being. 2, this harm is intended by the state, so punishment involves intentional harm. If I trip and I knock you over, I've caused you some harm, but that's not what we would consider a form of punishment because I didn't intend to harm you, right? 3, the harm is believed to be fitting, i.e. Fitting to the facts. In particular, maybe that the individual violated some legal set of laws in the legal code. Also, there's an expressive component to punishment, i.e. the state expresses its disapproval, both of the offender and of the offense. So there's a kind of denunciatory aspect of punishment where the state expresses a disapproval, and there's and the person acts in some kind of legal official capacity for the state. So punishment requires someone having the authority to carry out the punishment. I just wanted to lay that out, even though it's probably more definition than we need, because later what I'm going to argue is my alternative is not just an alternative to retributivism, but also is a non-punitive approach in that it doesn't satisfy this definition of punishment. It doesn't include the denunciatory component or the intentional harm component. Okay, so one of the most prominent justifications for legal punishment, both historically and presently, is what is known as retributivism. So I'm going to just give you a brief idea of what retributivism is. Of course, I have a whole chapter in the book that analyzes different varieties of retributivism. But in general, the retributive justification for punishment maintains that punishment of the wrongdoer is justified for the reason that they deserve it. They deserve something bad to happen to them just because they've knowingly done wrong. And that bad thing could include pain, deprivation, all the way up to the death penalty. Sadly, the United States still has the death penalty. So the 2 key components that I want to bring out with regard to retributivism is that it's grounded in the notion of just desserts. And just desserts, I'm not referring to what you have after dinner or desserts. By just desserts, I mean the individual justly deserves to suffer in proportion to their wrongdoing. And retributivism is grounded in the notion that wrongdoers deserve to be punished. But it's also, this is the second feature, purely backward looking. Retributive punishment is grounded simply in the fact that the individual knowingly did wrong, not in what we would consider forward-looking reasons. Reasons like punishment may help deter crime, or punishment may help in the moral formation or education of wrongdoers, or punishment may make us safer. Those are sort of forward-looking reasons one could give for punishment. So if I ask why punish an individual, one answer you may give is they deserve it. That's backward-looking, that's retributive. It's grounded in the notion of giving that individual their just desserts. Or you might say something like, well, we should punish the person because it will deter them or others from doing crime in the future, or will keep us safe, or some forward-looking good. That would be a different type of justification. And so the key aspects of retributivism are that it's generally committed to the following 3 principles. 1, that those who commit certain kinds of wrongful acts, in this case, paradigmatically crimes, morally deserve to suffer. So there's that notion of just desserts, that the individual justly deserves to suffer. The second is that that suffering is intrinsically morally good. Good without reference to any of these forward-looking goods that I mentioned. So the idea is that it's intrinsically morally good if some legitimate punisher, i.e. the state, gives the wrongdoer the punishment they deserve. And generally, retributivists also subscribe to a proportionality principle that demands that the punishment be proportionate to the crime. And often retributivists see this as providing some kind of protective force to punishment because it makes it impermissible to punish innocent people, and it makes it wrong to punish an individual disproportionately. But part of what I want to argue later is that the purported protections that retributivism provides in that third principle, the proportionality principle, is more apparent than real. But I'll come back to that. So maybe the best way to understand the two aspects that I'm highlighting, the backward-lookingness of retributivism and the notion of desert, is to use an example from the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. So he gave this really famous example. Some of you may be familiar with the example. And he says, imagine an island society, a society where the individuals decide they're going to disband, they're going to dissolve the social contract, and they're going to all leave the island. And there's one person left. They're the last person to sort of leave the island. And there's one remaining prisoner in jail. And the individual is in jail for murder. Kant asks, would it be morally justified to punish that individual? And for Kant, the only suitable punishment for murder was death. He was in favor of the death penalty. Now, I should mention not all retributivists support the death penalty. But the question is whether or not one would be morally justified in punishing that murderer, either in this case by executing them or some other means, before the last person leaves. And Kant says not only would you be justified, you'd be required. Again, not all retributivists share that second notion, but it's grounded in the notion of desert. So here's the quote. He says, even if a civilized society resolved to dissolve itself with the consent of all its members, as might be supposed in the case of a people inhabiting an island resolving to separate and scatter themselves throughout the whole world, the last murderer lying in prison ought to be executed before the resolution was carried out. And this ought to be done in order that everyone may realize the desert of his deeds. There's that notion of giving the individual their just deserts. So you get the notion of desert. You also get the purely backward-looking nature of retributivism, because you're not punishing this individual to deter crime. There's no one left to deter. You're not punishing this individual to make society safe. There's no one left on the island to protect. You're not punishing this individual for their own moral well-being or to help educate them, because in this case, you're murdering them. There's no forward-looking good that comes in executing this person, but Kant says not only would you be justified, you're obligated to do so. And it's both because of the purely backward-looking nature of desert. It doesn't matter that whether or not it has any forward-looking benefit. It's intrinsically good that wrongdoers get what they deserve. Probably the most prominent contemporary defender of retributivism is the legal scholar Michael Moore, and he holds a position very similar to Kant's. And so I'll just read the quote because I think it captures the two aspects again. He says, retributivism is the view that we ought to punish offenders because and only because they deserve to be punished. So there you get the notion of just deserts again. And he says punishment is justified for retributivists solely by the fact that those who receive it deserve it. Now he mentions, well, there might be some of these forward-looking benefits, but he's going to suggest they're not part of the justification. So he says, well, you know, punishment may deter future crime, incapacitate dangerous persons, educate citizens in the behavior required for a civilized society, reinforce social cohesion, prevent vigilante behavior, make victims feel better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, and here's the key part, he says, yet for a retributivist, these are a happy surplus that punishment produces and form no part of what makes punishment just. So for a retributivist, he says, deserving offenders should be punished even if the punishment produces none of these other surplus good effects. Purely backward looking, purely grounded in the notion of desert. Now in the book, I distinguish between what's called weak moderate and strong versions of retributivism, and I'm not going to go through the sort of differences. They all sort of agree on the core component of punishment being distributed in accordance with desert and it being proportional. So Mitchell Berman is another contemporary legal scholar, a more moderate retributivist, but he too writes, a person who unjustifiably and inexcusably causes or risks harm to others or to significant social interest deserves to suffer for that choice. And he deserves to suffer in proportion to the extent to which his regard or concern for others falls short of what is properly demanded of him. So in that quote, you get both the notion of just deserts and the proportionality condition. Okay, I don't know why I keep saying beeping like that. So I've now explained to you at least my definition of legal punishment, and I've explained what retributive punishment is. And now we could ask the core question of the talk, which is retributive legal punishment ever justified? And in the book, I develop 6 distinct arguments against retributivism. So the answer for me is no. Retributive legal punishment is never justified. I can't go into detail with all 6. And in fact, I can't really go into a lot of detail with any because each of these would individually take a whole talk. But my first argument is what I call the skeptical argument. And it has to do with my issues on free will. So this is where free will will come into the conversation. So one reason to think that agents do not deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done in this purely backward-looking sense, i.e. the sense required for retributivism, is that they're not free and morally responsible in the sense required. All right, so this brings me to my free will skepticism. So I'm a free will skeptic. As a free will skeptic, I maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And because of this, we're never morally responsible for our actions in the basic desert sense. Now, this is a very particular and precise sense, but the basic desert sense of moral responsibility is the sense that one would truly deserve to be praised or blamed, punished or rewarded for their actions. So for me, I define free will in terms of the control and action required for what's known as basic desert, moral responsibility. Exactly the kind of desert that's at play in the retributive account, i.e. the basic notion of desert is a purely backward-looking notion where individuals would truly deserve to be praised or blamed, punished or rewarded simply for having done the wrong thing or the good thing. And so I have in my work, in some of my previous books, in my 2 new books, and in a host of different papers, defended and developed arguments for free will skepticism. Now, some people worry that if we adopt the skeptical perspective, this is going to lead to nihilism or despair, or we're going to just have to let criminals run free, or it would undermine meaning in life. And so in my work, I have argued for optimism about the practical implications of free will skepticism. So I call myself an optimistic skeptic. And I have tried in my work to systematically go through addressing different domains of concern, arguing that the free will skeptic can preserve what we care about. And so I'm optimistic about the practical implications of free will skepticism. I maintain as an optimistic skeptic that the prospects of finding meaning in life or sustaining good interpersonal relationships would not be threatened. Morality and moral judgments would still remain in place. And although retributivism and certain severe forms of punishment like the death penalty would have to be ruled out, not a bad thing in my book, there are going to be alternative approaches to address criminal behavior, which is what I'll get to later. Okay, so the hard part is to lay out the arguments for my skepticism, and I sadly can't go through them all here, but I could take questions about them at the end. I'll give you a very quick sense of what my reasons are, but I'll just suggest before I do that these are the 2 hardest slides in my talk, so just bear with me for a moment if this is a challenge for you. So in the past, the main reason for adopting skepticism about free will was called hard determinism. The view that is known as hard determinism maintained that determinism is true, where determinism is the thesis that facts about the remote past, in conjunction with the laws of nature, entail that there's only one fixed future. So the determinist thesis is sort of a scientific version of it, is based on the laws of nature. And it says that every event or action, including human action, is the inevitable result of preceding events and actions in combination with the laws of nature. And so hard determinists argue that determinism is true and incompatible with free will. So we lack free will. And and determinism is incompatible with free will either because it's incompatible with the ability to do otherwise, what's sometimes known as leeway incompatibilism, or because determinism is incompatible with agents being the ultimate source of their actions, what's called source incompatibilism. Because if determinism is true, the ultimate source of the action drains back to antecedent conditions that are beyond the control of the agent. There aren't that many hard determinists alive today. Hard determinism had its peak at the kind of pinnacle of classical physics. Einstein himself was a hard determinist, Spinoza, Baron de Halbach. And this is when the Newtonian laws of physics were thought to be completely deterministic. Some people now note that there are certain interpretations of quantum mechanics that allows for some perhaps indeterminacy at the very lowest level of the universe, the subatomic level of quarks, where there may be some indeterminacy. And so some people say that rules out universal determinism. I'll just say a couple things about that. One, the final interpretation of physics hasn't been written yet. There are deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics. Bohmian mechanics, for example, is deterministic. And even if there's some indeterminacy at the subatomic level, many people still think that there's determinism at the level that matters, the level of neural networks, of brain activity, and human action. That said, I'm officially agnostic about the truth of determinism. So I'm what's called a hard incompatibilist. I maintain that while determinism is incompatible with free will and basic desert moral responsibility, so too is indeterminism, especially the variety posited by quantum mechanics. So my view is that we lack free will either way. Now, here is a kind of more detailed statement of my arguments, although, again, it would take me more than a single talk to go through all these arguments. But these are laid out in both the new books and in some of my previous work. So against the view that free will is compatible with the causal determination of our actions by natural factors beyond our control, i.e. against the view known as compatibilism that tries to reconcile free will and determinism, I argue that there's no relevant difference between that prospect and our actions being causally determined by manipulators. This is what's sometimes referred to as the manipulation argument. I won't go into it. I'll just say that in my work, I've laid out arguments for why we should reject the view known as compatibilism. I also argue that in addition to determinism being a problem, also the pervasiveness of luck poses a challenge for free will. And in fact, I defend a second completely independent argument for skepticism based on luck, but maybe I'll come back to that argument later. Against the idea that, well, what if we just brought in indeterminacy at the level of individual events? So this is known as event causal libertarianism. Here, libertarianism isn't a political view, it's a metaphysical view about free will. And it says that, yes, determinism is incompatible with free will, but maybe there's some indeterminacy at the level of events, and that could preserve free will. Well, against that view, I object that on such accounts of agents are left unable to settle whether a particular decision occurs, and hence lacks the control and action required for what I call basic desert moral responsibility. And that's because individuals are no more in control of indeterminate events than they are in control of determined events. And so if it's simply a matter of indeterminacy at the level of events, agents lack the control necessary to settle which outcome actually occurs. The last view that is often defended is the idea of agent causal libertarianism. And this is where the libertarian brings in certain notions of agency that go beyond events. They appeal to the notion of a substance separate from events that is capable of causing various events, but itself is uncaused. So here you get some really strange metaphysical requirements positing notions of agents as substance, distinct from their physical makeups, etc. Against those views, I argue that they simply can't be reconciled with our best physical theories. And then they also face additional problems accounting for mental causation. They can't be reconciled with law governing understanding of the physical world. On such accounts, reasons are not causes for action, which is potentially problematic. So in general, my view is essentially that all of the prevailing accounts that try to preserve free will fail, and they fail for different reasons. And as a result, we should adopt the skeptical perspective, that free will skepticism is the only rational position that we could adopt. So as a skeptic, I maintain that what we do and the way we are is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And now we could say those factors can include determinism, which is beyond our control, indeterminism, or luck, because we don't control any of those factors. And because of that, we're never morally responsible for our actions in what's called the basic desert sense, the sense that would make us truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward in a purely backward-looking, non-consequential sense. Now, if that's true, free will skepticism is inconsistent with retributivism because it does away with the idea of basic desert, which is exactly the notion that is needed to ground or justify retributive punishment. So free will skepticism implies that the retributive justification of punishment is unsound, and therefore has practical implications. It entails that a major element of our criminal justice system is unjustified. So that was my first argument. I have 5 more, and I can see that I'm already falling a little behind, but let me just quickly say something about the second. Let's say you're not convinced that we lack free will. Well, I have a second argument that says there still may be strong, what is called epistemic reasons against adopting retributive punishment. And this is because the burden of proof lies on those who want to inflict intentional harm on others. And so I lay out an argument something like this, that legal punishment, as my definition I introduced at the beginning stated, it requires intentional harm. So legal punishment intentionally inflicts harm on individuals. And the justification for such harm has to meet a high epistemic standard, a high bar. That means if you're going to intentionally harm somebody, you have to have good reasons, good justification. In fact, it's even true with foreseeable harm, where you're not even intending to harm, but you could foresee your actions would cause harm. You have to have good justification for engaging in such harmful acts. The bar is even higher, I argue, when it comes to intentionally inflicting harm on others, which is what the criminal justice system does when it separates individuals from their loved ones, when it punishes people by putting them in prison, when it deprives them of their liberty. And so if you're going to intentionally inflict harm on individuals, you have to have really good justification. Now, I argue the level of justification has to reach the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt, but we could argue about that. Second, if it's significantly probable that one's justification for harming another is unsound, well, then prima facie the behavior is seriously wrong. So if I were to harm you without good justification, well, that on the surface seems like it's seriously wrong to do. Now, what's the retributivist justification for legal punishment? Well, it's based on the assumption that agents are free and morally responsible in the basic desert sense. It's exactly that assumption that grounds the Kantian notion of punishing the individual on purely backward-looking grounds. It's exactly that notion that Michael Moore and Berman Mitchell are appealing to, and other retributivists. And then here's the key premise. The justification, though, for claiming that agents are morally responsible in this basic desert sense, provided by all the accounts, libertarian accounts, compatibilist accounts, face powerful and unresolved objections, and then therefore fall far short of that high epistemic standard that's required to intentionally harm individuals. Hence, legal retributive punishment is unjustified, and the harms it causes are prima facie seriously morally wrong. Now, this argument only requires a weaker form of skepticism. My first argument, the skeptical argument, is an attempt to show that agents are never free in this basic desert. This argument simply says, look, even if you're not convinced by the arguments against free will, reasons for thinking we have free will don't reach the level of justification or warrant necessary to base our policies of punishment on and to justify extremely retributive and punitive practices like intentionally harming wrongdoers. And because we don't reach that bar, we should conclude that retributive punishment is unjustified and the harms it causes are seriously wrong. All right, let me just see how much time I have here. So I might have to sadly skip some of my other arguments. I said that I developed 6. And the sad part is that these other arguments are independent of my skepticism. So I developed 4 arguments in the book that are developed to argue against retributivism, which are independent of issues having to do with free will. So even if you don't agree with my view on free will, we might still have good independent reason for rejecting retributivism. One I call the indeterminacy and judgment argument, and that's because how the state goes about judging the gravity of a wrong done on the one hand, and what counts as proportional punishment for that wrong on the other, is wide open, I argue, to subjective and cultural biases and prejudices. So if you were to think about it, according to the retributivist view, you first have to have a rank order of grievous wrongs, which types of crimes are worse than others. And then you look across the column and you see, well, what's the proportional punishment? What's the deserved punishment for that wrong? The problem is that both the ordering of gravity and the ordering of proportionality are subjected to all kinds of biases, cultural biases, and power differentials, and all kinds of examples I give in the book of where, say, judgments of gravity are dependent upon are subjective they're indeterminate, and therefore they're subjected to cultural biases and prejudices. So one example would be things like, in the past, homosexuality was viewed as a gravest wrong, punishable by death. We no longer think that in most liberal democracies. And so how do you determine what kinds of acts are wrong and how gravely wrong are they is going to be open to all kinds of cultural interpretations, which opens the door for all kinds of violations. On the other hand, let's imagine we all take intentional murder. Well, that's got to be high on the list. Everyone agrees that that's one of the most grievous crimes one commit. But not all retributivists agree on what is a proportional punishment. Kant said death. Other retributivists say, no, life in prison, death's too harsh. Others say life in prison's too harsh. And so even if you could agree on gravity, we don't necessarily agree on proportionality. And so my argument in this example is that the putated protections that retributivism is supposed to provide with its proportionality principle are more apparent than real. I'm going to skip the misalignment argument, sadly, and what I call the poor epistemic argument, and just get to my solution in a moment. So let me just end with my 6th reason for rejecting retributivism is that there are just good practical reasons for rejecting it. It has limited effectiveness in promoting certain important social goals. And that's partly because retributivism is not designed to consider forward-looking goods. Remember the quote earlier that these are surplus goods that form no part of what makes retributive punishment just. It doesn't care about how effective it is. It's just focused on giving individuals their just deserts. But look at what's actually occurred in our criminal justice system. So the United States makes up actually less than 5% of the world's population. We're roughly about 4.5% of the world's population. Yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. That's the largest rate of incarceration known to civilization. No other society in the history of mankind has ever incarcerated that many members of its society. In fact, the United States imprisons roughly 700 people for every 100,000 people. Compare that to, say, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, certain Scandinavian countries. They imprison roughly 60 people for every 100,000. So we literally imprison over 10 times as many people as these other nations. And we don't have good results for it. We have one of the highest rates of recidivism in the developed world. 85% of prisoners will be rearrested within the first 5 years of release. And that's partly because our criminal justice approach to crime is punitive, retributive. And so it's not focused on rehabilitation. It's not focused on improving the work skills. It's not focused on the underlying causes. It's focused on distributing punishment in accordance to what we consider individual responsibility. And in that sense, our prisons are harsh, cold environments that end up actually being counterproductive in that you still kind of learn helplessness in individuals when you control every aspect of their lives, when they sleep, what they eat, when they go to bed. You cage them, you dehumanize them, you house them in inhumane environments, and then you release them and expect them to be model citizens, and we know it doesn't work. All right, so what's the alternative? In the book, I go through some well-known alternatives to retributivism and argue that there are independent reasons for rejecting those. But what I'll focus on in the remainder of my talk is my own positive account. And so my thesis, what I propose, is something called the public health quarantine model. And I argue that it's not only consistent with my free will skepticism, it's both ethically defensible, practically workable, and far more humane than retributivism. And so the model has two key parts: the quarantine analogy part, which comes and builds off a work by the philosopher Dirk Purenboom at Cornell, and the public health part, which adopts aspects of public health ethics and the public health framework and applies it in the context of criminal justice and to criminal behavior. All right, so let me start with the quarantine analogy. So just think, the argument runs something like this. Look, free will skeptics claim that criminals are not morally responsible for their actions in the so-called basic desert sense. And that's simply because on the skeptic account, no one is morally responsible in this sense. I should say that free will skepticism is consistent with other types of responsibility. And so skeptics don't reject all notions of responsibility. They are able to preserve what I call causal responsibility or attributability or answerability or role responsibility. And I could talk about those other notions later, but it rejects this fundamental basic notion of moral responsibility. Well, think about people with communicable diseases, say Ebola. Well, if I were to get on a plane to come to Canada to give this talk in person, and I were to contract Ebola along the way, when I get off the plane and I'm, say, test positive, I think all of us would agree that the state is justified in quarantining me. And the justification for quarantine would not have to appeal to free will, wouldn't have to appeal to moral responsibility, wouldn't have to appeal to retributivism or just deserts. The main justification for quarantine would be grounded in what I call the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others. We are justified in limiting the liberty of the individual with a communicable disease to prevent a pandemic. And so you could justify quarantine without appeal to free will, moral responsibility, retributivism, just deserts. And so my argument is that a analogous incapacitation account could be given for incapacitating seriously dangerous criminals like serial killers and child molesters. And the argument would be that we're justified in incapacitating these seriously dangerous criminals on the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we would have for quarantining people with a communicable disease. i.e., we could justify incapacitating seriously dangerous criminals without appealing to free will, without appealing to more basic desert moral responsibility, retributivism, just deserts. Now, if you adopt this account, a number of really important things follow, however. And I think all of these reforms are really important and needed and essential. The first is that as less dangerous diseases justify only preventative measures less restrictive than quarantine, so less dangerous criminal tendencies justify only more moderate constraints. What does that mean? It means if I were to sneeze on you and you get sick, oh, I caused you some harm. But generally, we don't think we should quarantine people with the common cold. And that's because we generally adopt what I call the principle of least restriction. We should adopt the least restrictive measure possible, consistent with the protection of public health and safety. So if there's a less restrictive option, we should opt for the less restrictive option. And so on my account, the vast majority of things we currently incarcerate people for, we shouldn't. incarcerate people for, that there are less restrictive means that would be better suited. So the vast majority of people in US prisons suffer from mental illness. 64% of jailed inmates are reported to have mental illness, 54% of state prisoners, 75% of women who are incarcerated have a diagnosable mental illness. Most of these people would be better served with mental health services. The vast majority of people in US prisons have an underlying addiction problem. Many of these people would be better suited with drug treatment options. And there are many types of crimes, in my view, that don't warrant incapacitation because they don't pose a serious enough threat, like the analogy of a common cold. We accept a certain amount of risk within society is acceptable, and we restrict quarantine to really limited, really precise, really extreme cases. And so my model is consistent with the decriminalization of a number of things we currently incarcerate people for. So for example, I recently helped co-author a paper that was published in the American Journal of Bioethics calling for an end on the war of, the end of the war on drugs, because I think that we should decriminalize, say, personal possession of marijuana. It shouldn't be an offense that rises to the level of incapacitation. Second, my model would demand a degree of concern for the rehabilitation and well-being of criminals. So go back to the quarantine case. You have me at the airport for Ebola, you quarantine me. Well, the story doesn't end there. You have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer a threat to society. In fact, you lack any justification for continuing to hold me the minute I'm no longer contagious. And so on my model, the focus of the criminal justice system should be reoriented toward rehabilitation and reintegration. So instead of adopting punitive approaches to crime, we should adopt both first preventative approaches to crime, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then for those who've already committed crimes, the goal should be rehabilitation and reintegration. And I've even written in my book about the design of prisons or the design of institutions of incapacitation, because the idea is that these institutions should be designed not for punitive purposes, which our current prisons tend to be designed for, but for rehabilitative purposes. And my model is that the individual loses no other rights other than their liberty, that the sentencing court can only justify limiting the liberty of the individual, just like we could justify limiting the liberty of the person with the communicable disease, but we can't justify taking away their voting rights or giving disenfranchising them from housing opportunities or from dehumanizing them. And so my model is a very limited model in that it only gives the state the justification to limit liberty, but not to be punitive or inhumane or to strip them of their other basic rights. So note that this incapacitation account is a non-punitive account. We don't punish the person with Ebola when we quarantine them. By no standard definition of punishment does that constitute punishment. We're not condemning them. There's no condemnatory component. There's no communicative denunciation of their actions. There's no intention to commit harm. And so my account is actually not an account of punishment. It's an alternative to punishment. Lastly, if a criminal can't be rehabilitated and our safety requires their indefinite confinement, this account provides no justification for making their life more miserable than would be required to guard against the dangers they pose. So certain types of cruel punishments like solitary confinement, some of the harsher forms of punishment that we see in US prisons would, on my account, be unjustified. Individuals have to be housed in humane environments that foster rehabilitation and reintegration, that allow for the maximum amount of autonomy within those institutions, that retain their other basic rights. Okay, I owe you, so I'm going to just skip this principle, but I owed you an account of what do I do for a serial killer. So people say, oh, well, you're a real skeptic. What do you do with dangerous criminals? Well, I just gave you my account. It's an incapacitation account based on the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification for quarantine. But the public health part of my model is the part I find to be most revolutionary, in that I want to shift the focus away from the myopic obsession with punishment and shift it to prevention and social justice. So in my book, I'm essentially proposing that we reject a kind of reactive approach to violence and adopt a preventive approach to violence. And the model I propose is grounded in a well-established, has a long track record framework of public health ethics. So when I developed my account, by the way, most people didn't have any personal experience with public health ethics or with quarantine. That can't quite be said anymore with COVID. And so in some ways, people are far more familiar with these approaches now personally than they ever have been in the past. But the idea here is that the public health framework has been long established for addressing health inequalities and poor health outcomes. And what it systematically does is focus on prevention and social justice. And what I'm going to argue is that the criminal justice system should adopt a public health approach toward violence, like we adopt a public health approach toward public health, toward poor health outcomes, that aims at preventing those outcomes in the first place and addressing the underlying social injustices. So let me look at each of these components just real quick. I should be done in the next 10 minutes. So think of real public health institutions, like in the United States, we have the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, or the Food and Drug Administration, or the Environmental Protection Agency, or the Consumer Protection Agency. I'm sure if you were to look up on their websites what their mission statement is, each of these would have a preventative mission statement, i.e. the CDC's primary mission is to prevent outbreaks of disease, to prevent pandemics. The CDC will only use quarantine after it's failed in its primary mission, i.e. it only resorts to quarantine as a stopgap measure after it's failed to achieve its initial goal, which was prevention. The Food and Drug Administration is designed to prevent contamination of food and harmful drugs, and the Environmental Protection Agency is geared toward preventing the contamination of air, soil, and water, right? So these are essentially preventative institutions. And so what I propose is that a non-retributive approach to criminal justice modeled on this public health approach would similarly be focused on prevention. And so on my account, we can't successfully address issues of criminal justice reform without simultaneously addressing issues of social justice. And that's because the preventative aspects of the model are going to require that we address certain underlying systemic causes of violence and criminal behavior. So in my book, and this is probably my favorite chapter, although it's the one that's the least theoretical, is I go through in this very lengthy chapter identifying what I call the social determinants of criminal behavior. And I argue that the social determinants of criminal behavior are essentially analogous to the social determinants of health. Now, the social determinants mean the social conditions that cause and drive these poor health outcomes, or that these are the social conditions or social structures that drive criminal behavior. And analyzing thousands of different studies, I propose that these are not an exhaustive list, but I propose that the social determinants of both health and criminal behavior include things like poverty, low socioeconomic status, abuse, exposure to violence, housing, access to healthcare, mental illness, environmental health, education, and nutrition. It's very easy to see how these are associated with health. So the statistics bear this out in great detail. We know, for example, poverty and low socioeconomic status is the greatest driver of things like morbidity and type 2 diabetes and certain types of heart disease. And so to address those poor health outcomes, you have to address the underlying causes, which is social. Well, the same thing is true with incarceration rates. Norway, for example, did a total population study. They looked at the entire population of Norway. And the study found that children that come from parents in the lowest socioeconomic bracket were twice as likely to be convicted of violent crimes. Twice. So it doubled the probability of incarceration. And so we know that these things are associated with both poor health outcomes and criminal behavior. Abuse is a good example. So one study found in Rikers Island that women who were incarcerated in Rikers Island, 85 to 90% of them, 90%, had a history of, were victims of violence in the past, i.e. they were victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse. So we know that one of the underlying causes for incarceration in this case is the prior exposure to violence themselves. And that's because the women either commit violent acts against their abusers, or often there's a co-addiction issue. And so they are addicted with their abusers, and at the behest of their abusers, they engage in petty crimes under maybe the threat of violence. Sometimes women who are abused have a difficult time maintaining jobs. Unemployment rates are much higher among women who've experienced domestic violence. And so because they can't hold the job, they may resort to petty crime. So if we want to prevent the women from being incarcerated in the first place, the most humane and obvious and most effective thing to do would be to address the underlying social determinants. And the same thing is true with access to stable housing and healthcare. I mentioned mental illness. More than 50% of people in prisons in the United States suffer from a diagnosable mental illness. Education, nutrition. I could go through each, but I won't. Hopefully you get the point. And then the social justice part. So think again about health issues. So when public health institutions study, say, infant mortality rates in India, what they'll find is that children die at higher rates during childbirth or in early adolescence. And to understand that poor health outcome, you have to study the underlying cause. And in most cases, in the example in India in particular, is that it often has to do with underlying sexist norms. Most women in India lack reproductive control over their bodies. And so at the behest of their husband or their in-laws, they're forced to have more children, which raises the chances that they may die in childbirth or one of the children may die. They often lack access to birth control. Literacy rates are really low, and we learn that raising literacy rates decreases infant mortality rates. And so if you want to address the poor health outcome, you have to essentially fix and address the underlying social injustices. And so the same is true with criminal behavior. If we want to systemically prevent criminal behavior in a holistic way that's more humane, we need to address the underlying social determinants of crime, which include racism, sexism, economic inequality, educational inequity, poverty, lack of access to affordable health care, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, on my model, the criminal justice and social justice aspects end up coming quite close together, because we can't successfully address criminal justice reform without simultaneously adopting practices and policies that target and seek to prevent the social determinants of crime, which are often driven by underlying social injustices. All right. In my book, I actually develop an account of social justice grounded in what I call the capabilities approach. For philosophers out there, they might be familiar with this, but I won't go into it. But the goal of the state should be to provide a sufficient level of certain types of capacities that are necessary or essential for human well-being. And I identify a few there on the screen, but I won't go into it. So this is my last slide. So on the public health and quarantine model approach, it's consistent with my skepticism about free will. It is consistent with the skeptical argument, the epistemic argument, the additional reasons for rejecting retributivism. I think it's ethically defensible. I think it's practically workable, and I think it's far more humane than retributivism. And part of the reason is when we keep ourselves focused obsessively on the level of individual responsibility, it blinds us to the underlying causes of crime. And when you look at things through the lens of individual responsibility, well, then your solution is natural to take a punitive approach toward crime. Well, if crime is the result of individual responsibility, then the right response to crime is punitive punishment, um, and grounded in the notion that the individual deserves it. But once you reject basic desert, it allows us to look more deeply into the causes that shape individuals and to look more holistically at the social systems that actually cause crime, and allows us to shift the focus and the myopic obsession with punishment to prevention. And so instead of taking a reactive approach, we're taking a preventative approach grounded in social justice and public health, and developing the conditions or the capabilities needed for human well-being. Um, and I think that that is a preferable approach. I think it's a more effective approach. I think it's a more humane approach. And I think it's a more consistent approach in that it fits with our best philosophical and scientific theories about human behavior and the best understanding of human behavior, and whether or not individuals justly deserve to be punished in the way that the retributivist assumes. Okay, there was a lot more to be said. I'm sorry this went a little over what I said, but I think I'll just end here and take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Greg. We'll now take some questions, and so there have been a few questions that have come in, which I'll get started. But I'm going to ask people to please put your questions in the chat. I will be posing all the questions, so we're not going to allow people to give questions by voice. So we're asking people just to put your question in the chat, and I will pose the question. A couple questions that came in. One of the first ones is, are you a moral realist?
It's a good question. I mean, working on my meta-ethical view here, and I think I'm going to resist from committing myself to either realism or anti-realism here. I think there are ways to spin skepticism in ways that fit with realism, and ways that are consistent with denial of realism. I'll just say this though about morality for me. I think that as a free will skeptic, we could preserve most of what we care about. So, for example, axiological judgments, axiological moral judgments, or judgments of right and wrong, good and bad behavior. Well, those still remain in place for me. Those are not dependent on the notion of basic desert. So we could still say, for example, that what Hitler did is wrong. There's nothing inconsistent with us defining certain moral judgments in terms of right and wrong, good and bad, whether we take a realist or anti-realist kind of meta-ethics. Also, I said earlier that I don't reject all kinds of responsibility. My skepticism is consistent with other types of responsibility. So, for example, individuals are still causally responsible. So the individual who committed the murder is causally responsible for the murder. We could also say individuals are attributability. They have attributability responsibility, i.e. we could attribute various character flaws, predispositions, intentions, mens rea, those kinds of states to individuals. That's consistent with the denial of basic desert. And I argue that certain types of moral protest would still be justified. So, for example, if you think about parenting. So when my daughter does something that I don't approve of and I want to teach her to be a better person, often what we'll do is we'll engage in a kind of moral conversation, a kind of moral dialogue. I'll ask her, do you think that what you did was good? Well, why did you do it? Can you reflect upon the reasons for which you did it? Can you identify any sort of flaw in your own character that was the cause of why you ended up performing this bad act? Can we agree that maybe moving forward, your work at trying to address that flaw in your own character? And Dirk Pereboom has argued that that kind of moral responsibility is consistent with skepticism because it's not grounded in basic desert. Instead, it's grounded in three non-desert deseratum, i.e. future moral formation, future reconciliation, and future safety. I have a stake in the moral formation of my daughter, so I can engage her in this kind of moral dialogue or conversation aimed at modifying her behavior moving forward. Reconciliation is often an aspect of our interpersonal relationships that we care a lot about. And so that's a forward-looking good. And safety is a forward-looking good. And those kind of forward-looking justifications, I argue, are still consistent. Without answering the question about realism, I'll just say that I think that we could preserve most of what we care about when it comes to morality. Now, what you say from the meta-ethical perspective, I still am not committed to, because I want to hold off, because I may eventually write a book on that topic, which if I ever do, will be titled something like Morality Without Moral Responsibility.
Thank you. One question about has come up in the chat a lot about talking about Hitler and Nazis, etc. So the question is, under your model, what would we do about things like the Nuremberg trial, current trials of old Nazis, and modern prosecution of war criminals?
Okay, great. Well, I could give you and dance around a kind of answer to some, but let me actually, I'll take the most difficult version of that question. I think the strongest objection to my theory, or my public health quarantine model, would be what I call the 90-year-old Nazi example. So let's imagine some Nazi committed real atrocities during World War II. He was engaged in acts of genocide. But after the war ended, he fled Germany and he made his way to South America, as many high-ranking Nazis actually did. And let's say he successfully evaded capture throughout most of his life. And so now he's in his 90s and we hunt him down and we find him. But for 50 or so years, he's been, let's say, a model citizen. He's committed no crimes. He's been a good contributor to his community. We have no good reason for thinking he's a forward-looking threat. Well, that poses a real problem for my model, because my model can only justify limiting the liberty of individuals if they pose a current sort of forward-looking threat to society. So I would just bite the bullet. So I think every theory has to go through some what's called reflective equilibrium. We use our intuitions to arrive at our conclusions and develop our theory, but then once we do, we use our theory to settle certain intuitions in difficult cases. And so for me, I would say that I'm sure many of you would have retributive impulses. Most of you would probably still feel that an individual really justly deserves to be punished. I don't care if they're a threat or not. They did this act and they deserve to be punished, even if they're 90. I would just say that I would let my theoretical commitments drive me and say, no, that's the wrong intuition. That's the wrong conclusion to draw. Now, saying that, I don't necessarily think that it's just the end of the story. I think that there might be justification for engaging in a process of restorative justice. There might be a good reason for having a trial. There might be a good reason to engage in a process where victims or descendants of victims sit down with individuals and engage in a process which is known as restorative justice, where individuals go through that kind of example of moral exchange I just gone over before with my daughter, but in a context of a criminal hearing or criminal context. I think there'd be good reason for condemning the acts. So the axiological judgments of condemning what the individual did or pointing out that what they did was bad is a very important aspect. But let me also throw in a couple other thoughts here, which is one, the issue of transitional justice is a really complicated one. And my model is generally designed for the context of criminal justice. But there are many models in transitional justice where you look at like South Africa after apartheid, where they underwent a reconciliation process and engaged in what is called a transitional justice process. Many of those models for transitional justice often have found and concluded, and this is true in South Africa, that to focus too much on a purely backward-looking retributive approach is counterproductive. And there have been numerous examples like South Africa where the healthier thing to do is to acknowledge wrongs that have been done and then figure out ways to successfully move forward. Now, if there are individuals that still subscribe to dangerous ideas or are still a danger to society, my model would justify incapacitation. There's no problem doing so. But the problem is for those individuals that don't. And I think that there may be alternative processes that we could justify, but I would argue that if a least restrictive approach is possible, we should always adopt the least restrictive approach. And I would just say that instead of ratcheting up our retributive responses in these borderline cases, I would rather ratchet down all of our retributive impulses across the board. Um, and so for some people who have really strong retributive impulses, they just may not find that intuitive, but then I would just challenge their underlying philosophical assumptions of whether or not that approach is actually truly justified.
Thank you. So a question about your definition of justice. The question is, do you consider that justice would be a social state as opposed to a response to crime?
Well, okay. I mean, I think there are different notions of justice. When people talk about criminal justice, they might have something different in mind than when they talk about social justice or distributive justice. Um, and so for me, in my book, I develop a capabilities approach to social justice. And this is for those who have any knowledge of the literature, similar to Martha Nussbaum and Sen's version of capabilities approaches. But instead of Nussbaum's 11, core 11 sort of capabilities, I bring them down to six main ones. What I would argue is that for me, social justice should be aimed at providing a sufficiency of certain conditions or preconditions for human well-being, such that these would be, if individuals lacked any one of these six, and I'm not wedded to the six, I don't mind modifying or adding to my theory, but if an individual were to sufficiently lack the capability of health or reasoning or self-determination or attachment or personal security, they would live a life that is severely diminished in well-being. And so the goal of social justice should be to provide a sufficient level of these basic capabilities that are necessary for achieving human well-being. And I think that this notion, I've argued in the book at least, is consistent with my skepticism, because some people sometimes think free will skeptics are not entitled to justice talk, but I think that that's wrong. I think that that's assuming that all theories of justice are desertist theories of justice, but that's just not true. Some theories of justice are desertist and some are non-desertist, i.e. they don't presuppose that justice is about desert in any fundamental way. And I argue that the capabilities approach is a non-desertist approach, or at least isn't presupposing basic desert moral responsibility, and therefore is consistent with my skepticism. And I use the capabilities approach as the moral foundation for my public health framework. So for me, my public health approach is not a consequentialist approach, or it's not a purely consequentialist approach. Instead, my public health approach is grounded in a moral foundation of justice, social justice, in particular, a capabilities approach to social justice. And then I argue that in that sense, public health institutions are essentially social justice institutions, that their goal is, or it should be, to provide a sufficiency of certain capacities or functionings necessary for human well-being. And so take an example like, well, here's an example. So, I might be getting too far in the weeds for the question, but there are people who think, like John Rawls, that that justice is just the matter of distributing goods in an equitable way. I think that overlooks what a more fundamental understanding of justice. So let's say if we just distributed bicycles to everybody, that would provide what is known as the function of mobility. So a capability or functioning that might be needed for individuals, let's say, to get around or to make it to their place of employment, is they have to have some ability of mobility. And let's say if they don't have mobility, then they can't get the jobs that they need to feed themselves. And so this is a cause of poverty, et cetera. So let's just say we distributed bicycles to everybody. Well, I would argue that doesn't solve the problem. Because what if one of those people who receive a bicycle is disabled? Or let's say a woman receives a bicycle in a society where there are sexist social norms that prohibit women from driving bicycles. Well, a simple distributive approach to goods would not solve the underlying social injustice. In this case, to give that woman a true functioning of mobility, you would have to address the underlying sexist norms in that society. That's what I mean by social justice. And so it's grounded in the idea that for that woman to have or be able to achieve a level of well-being that all individuals should have the right to be able to achieve, we have to address those kinds of social structures that might sort of diminish or impede, or what I call capability undermining, conditions. And so a simple distributive approach to goods, in my view, isn't going to solve the problem. We need something deeper, and I think the capabilities approach is deeper. For me, criminal justice then has to concern itself with social justice, because if you are primarily concerned with addressing violence, in my view, the best way of doing it is to treat it like a public health issue. And so let me just give you some examples. I mean, I didn't get in, and I didn't have enough time for this, but there is some precursors and some evidence that my approach works. So, for example, Scotland. I spent 6 months in Scotland a year ago, and I wrote my book actually while I was in Scotland. And at one point, Scotland was the murder capital of Europe. Glasgow was the murder capital of Europe, the city of Glasgow in Scotland. And they were experiencing an epidemic of stabbings, in particular cases where gangs were using knives or axes, slicing individual faces in gang fights and such. And it was such a problem that at one point in the early 2000s, they were the leading center for murder in all of Europe. And so what Scotland did is they ended up adopting a public health approach, essentially the kind of framework I suggest. And it started in this one individual police precinct where they adopted what they called a violence reduction unit. And what they did is essentially what I suggested needs to be done. What public health institutions already do, and what the public health ethics framework does, is it first identifies the underlying causes of poor health, or in this case, violence, prioritizes the causes, because we don't always have the funds to address all of them. So you prioritize which are the most important. And then you adopt practices aimed at targeting those social determinants. And then you use a best practices approach to kind of evaluating which practices are most successful. And what they found was, at least in Scotland, the driving cause of these knife attacks was, ironically, toxic masculinity in the society, unemployment, and alcohol consumption. Those were the three big ones. There were others. And so what they did was they adopted a holistic approach to addressing those three determinants. They went to schools. They had educational programs aimed at addressing the toxic masculinity. They had PSAs on television. They employed job training programs, and they adopted what is called a holistic approach. So when someone comes into the emergency room with a stabbing, instead of just treating the stab wound, which they do, they also look at what caused the underlying stabbing. And in many cases, the conflicts arise in context of unemployment or housing. And so you end up connecting them up with social services to address the underlying causes. And the same is true in other contexts, not just in hospitals, but every point of contact where an individual may come into contact with either the healthcare system or the criminal justice system or a social service program, is you adopt a holistic approach to looking not just at the crime, but the individual, and then addressing what kinds of circumstances in their lives might be driving the crime. And within a few years, Scotland cut their murder rate in half. And now it's one of the safest countries in Europe in terms of crime rates. Now, there are other examples that I could point to in South America, and there are pilot programs in inner cities that have used public health approaches. And essentially what they could do is they treat violence like they take an epidemiological approach to violence like they would with with outbreaks of disease. And you could see how violence tracks itself through certain communities, and how, like, just for example, on hot days in Chicago, crime rates go up. We know this, and we can model this using big data. And so if we know that, we could take active steps to reduce it. And so, for example, simply opening air conditioning facilities, public air conditioning facilities, or opening up sometimes fire hydrants in communities where violence tends to be high on hot days, actually has been shown to reduce violence in those communities. And so if you could understand the underlying causes, then you could identify them, target them, and then address them. And it's a long way of saying that I then use the criminal justice approach to address those capabilities that drive well-being and also the underlying social injustices.
Thank you. I think you've partially answered this question, but you talked about how the U.S. system doesn't do a very good job despite the number of people it incarcerates. And so the question is, other than for recidivism, what about deterrence? Are there any benefits for that?
So I have a whole chapter in the book on consequentialist or deterrence based theories of punishment, which are there's a couple of things to be said. One is that deterrence based models are consistent with my free will skepticism, because consequentialist theories of punishment or deterrence based theories are forward looking. That said, even though, so you could be a free will skeptic and you can embrace those justifications of punishment because they're not problematic in terms of a conflict with my skepticism. That said, I reject them for other reasons. So I choose not to include deterrence as providing any justificatory force in my model. And the reason is, and you may not agree with this, and there may be ways to get around these objections, but I think there are morally problematic features of deterrence approaches. So one is deterrence-based approaches can often justify using individuals as a means to an end. So one problem is that if we were to say, let's say we have an outbreak of petty crimes, just a petty crime spree that's taken over the community. And we know that, well, if we just capture the first person we get, the first petty criminal, let's just come down really hard on that individual. We'll give him life in prison for a small petty crime. And we know, let's just say hypothetically, it will effectively deter all the other petty criminals. Well, a deterrence or consequentialist theorist might think that the ends justify the means here, that, well, to effectively deter and prevent this crime spree, we just need to come down really hard on one individual. But my argument would be to give an individual life in prison for, stealing a 5-cent candy bar, or, a $10 item from Walmart would be excessively punitive response to such petty crime. And so for me, it would not be just. Another example is that you look at 3 strikes you're out laws in the United States. These were laws that were put in place in the 80s and 90s, where if you were to get 3 felony convictions, you would get life in prison. California was one of the states that put this in place. The justification for those 3 strikes you're out laws were initially deterrence-based, consequentialist justifications, not retributive. And the idea was, well, look, the best way to deter would-be felons is to have the knowledge out there and a clear set penalty that if you were to commit 3 felonies, you're going away for life. And this would be an effective deterrent. Now, whether or not it actually turned out to be an effective deterrent, it didn't, by the way, empirically, a deterrence theorist would have to be open to allowing that if it were effective. And my problem with that is that it's just it's ineffective, but it's also inhumane on an independent sort of moral standard. And so in the book, I actually give a case of a guy in California. I try to describe it so you don't know what the crime spree is. Like on September 1st, he hit his first Walmart in San Francisco. And 2 days later, he hit his second Walmart shop in the neighboring county. And he was on a crime spree. And then 3 days later, he hits his third crime. And you're not sure what the crimes are. And so what it turns out that, and this is based on a true case, the guy ended up stealing VHS tapes in 3 separate Walmarts, totaling, I think, $32 in property loss. Ironically, I thought it was funny. One of the videos he stole was called Free Willy, which I thought was fun because of the free will issue. He got life in prison in California because he had a prior felony, and with these 3 crimes, he was sentenced to life. I would argue that that is disproportionate punishment. And on my account, you can never justify it because on the incapacitation account I give, this individual's crimes don't raise enough of a threat to public safety to warrant life in prison. I don't even think they reach the level of warranting incapacitation, let alone life. And so I think there are other independent moral concerns I have with a deterrence-based theory, such that I think it would be preferable to offer an alternative. And my approach is an alternative. That said, I'll just add this because it might help whoever asked the question. I think I kind of get general deterrence on the cheap, which is that if we're transparent about our practices, if individuals know that people who are a violent threat to society and who commit crimes will be incapacitated, just in its very nature, being aware of those policies would have a natural deterrence effect. And so I think you kind of get deterrence on the cheap or deterrence for free, but I wouldn't want, for me at least, I don't favor building in deterrence as part of my core justification, because I think that opens up the door to certain types of abuses. And I in my book, for example, I argue that my model can adopt what I call a prohibition on manipulative use. That I, as a skeptic, can actually ground a principle, a very Kantian principle, that prohibits using individuals, manipulating individuals as a means to an end. And I think that's an advantage over consequentialist approaches. My principle of least restriction is at odds with certain consequentialist or deterrence-based approaches, because in some cases, a more punitive response would be a better deterrent. And yet on my model, you couldn't justify any policies that went beyond the least restrictive ones necessary to protect public health and safety. So I think the deterrence approaches allow for what I would consider excessive forms of punishment. I think they're even open to potentially allowing for the punishment of innocent people if it were somehow to be shown that it would effectively deter crime. Whereas my model would never allow for that, because an innocent person doesn't pose a threat to society. And so we can never justify incapacitating the innocent person, given that the innocent person poses no threat. And so the right of self-defense can never be used or triggered to limit their liberty.
Thank you. I have a practical question. Suppose I am a judge and a murder suspect has been convicted before me. How would I apply the quarantine approach rather than the retributive?
Yeah, good. So in the book, I spent a lot of time giving specific policy proposals, and some of them are up for debate. But one of the things I do want to argue is that a lot of what we currently do in sort of the court trial process would remain in place. So things like mens rea, which means criminal mind or criminal intent, proving that the individual had mens rea, all of that would still be relevant for me, but it'd be relevant in a different type of way than it would be for the retributivist. So let's take a case where there are 2 women. Each, let's say, is causally responsible for the death of their child. But let me describe the 2 cases so you can see the difference. One woman, let's say, came down with a stomach flu. She ate some bad sushi last night. She was up sick all night, didn't get any sleep, but realized she had to go to her early morning meeting because it was really important for her client. And she has 3 children, and 2 older ones she successfully drops off at school. But the infant falls asleep in the back, and she forgot about the infant and doesn't drop the child off at daycare. And then they go into work. Halfway through the day, they realize, wait, did I leave the kid in the car? They run out and they discover that the child has died from heat exposure. Okay, that's an accident, right? Let's say the second case is a woman who wants to intentionally murder her child. And she does it in a way to make it look like an accident. She, again, like the first woman, she leaves the child in the car. But she has mens rea, and she planned it, and she had premeditation. Now, the retributivist would say that part of what we need to do during the trial is establish that they're responsible in the basic desert sense, and then and that might include proving mens rea, distinguishing between the two cases, and then distributing punishment in accordance to the desert of the two women. What I would argue is that, well, mens rea is still relevant, but not for assessing guilt or not for assessing basic desert or just deserts. Instead, the two women pose different forward-looking threats to society. The woman who was a one-off accident, stomach flu, may not pose any threat to society moving forward. And so no, yes, she's causally responsible. So we have to prove, let's say, in a court case, in a trial, finding a fact that the individual was causally responsible for the death. So in both cases, we could attribute a causal responsibility to the women. But there's a big difference between the two women in that the state of mind matters, but not for assessing just deserts or retributivism, but for assessing what forward-looking threat these two women pose to society. And I would argue that the woman who engaged in premeditated murder is more of a threat to her other children and to society moving forward than the woman who was a one-off accident. And so one might warrant incapacitation, whereas the other would not. Now, let me even add more to that. Let me give you a third woman. A third woman is just like the first. She accidentally leaves her child in the car without any intent to harm the child, without mens rea, without premeditation. But, excuse me, unlike the first woman, she has a habitual character where she's always negligent. She has forgotten repeatedly to pick her children up at school on time. She shows up for appointments late. When all these other cases of negligence. Well, she's different than the first woman as well, because and my model can still account for that difference, because you could attribute those negligent character features to them without assuming they're responsible for having developed those features. And yet that negligence might be enough to distinguish between the third woman and the first, in that we might require the third woman to undergo some kind of counseling or some sort of supervision or some kind of parenting courses, because her negligence or her habitual negligence might pose a significant enough threat to other children, even though I don't necessarily think incapacitation would be warranted in that case either. So in particular trial, there is a big difference between both the outcomes. The retributive outcomes would be way different, I think, than the public health quarantine model. And secondly, the features of what you would be doing in the case would be similar, but they would serve different purposes. Now, the difference is that, let's say we incapacitate the woman who premeditatively killed her child. Well, the retributivist says life in prison. Well, I argue in my book, or maybe not, maybe 20 to life, or 20, after 20 years, they're eligible for parole. What I would argue in my book is I first argue that life in prison has to be taken off the table. I argue that a judge should not have the option of handing down life without the chance of parole. And the reason is, on my model, that every individual case is different. So not every crime, for the same crime, different individuals may pose different threats. And so we shouldn't have a blanket approach to all crimes that are similar, because individual cases will vary. Second, the option of giving life in prison takes off the table from the very get-go of rehabilitation or the chance of redemption. And I think that the purpose of the incapacitation should be rehabilitation and reintegration. And we should never give up on the chance of rehabilitation. And so there should never be the option of life without the chance of parole. Third, I use the example of Norway. Norway, the vast majority of criminal cases never resort in incarceration. I think over 90% of the cases in Norway never involve any prison sentence. Those that do, 90% of them end up serving less than a year. 90%. So that leaves only 10% of people who go to prison to serve more than a year. Whereas the vast majority of people in the United States go to prison for more than a year, often for very lengthy periods of time, often for very low-level crimes. And I don't know if people know this, in Norway, the max sentence anyone can get, even for murder, is 21 years in prison. And I propose something like that. And so what I suggest is that at least has the option. So what Norway can do is at the end of those 21 years, if you haven't been rehabilitated and you still pose a forward-looking threat to society, you can add 5-year increments. But the advantage of that approach is that it requires a continual reevaluation of a case. No one's just locked away and forgotten. There are required periodic reviews of the case. And in fact, I argue that anyone who wants to limit liberty carries the burden of proof. And so the state has to constantly carry the burden of proof of re-justifying the incapacitation. And so there should be periodic review of cases to see whether the individual does continue to pose a threat. Because just like the Ebola case, the minute the person is no longer contagious and no longer a threat to public health, you no longer have any justification for holding them. And I would say we have to be aware of that by constantly reevaluating it. So the outcomes would be drastically different, and the judge would have to adopt a completely different way of viewing both sentencing and the purpose of the trial. And so there would be really important, significant differences.
Thank you. Okay, a question about, we've talked about the US, we've talked about Scotland. Now we have a question about Chile and Venezuela. There they have some places where as public health measures, they're supporting music programs in poor and high crime neighborhoods. And they've claimed that these have made a significant improvement in lessening crime and drug use. So do you have any thoughts about this approach? And also related to this, do you have any thoughts about decolonization as an approach to crime reduction?
Yeah, great question. I do talk about some South American examples in the book, and they may be part of what the questioner was aware of. I can't remember if it was Chile or Venezuela or I'm trying to remember. But in the book, I talk about a particular case that there was a community riddled with gang violence and crime and basically drug crimes. And what they did is they came in and evaluated, again, like the public health approach would, what is the underlying causes? And so one of the things is that you end up, and this actually ties in nicely with the colonization question, you end up with these islands of communities of deprivation. And communities that lack all the sort of access to education and work and employment opportunities that wealthier communities would have access to. And the questioner, if they're out there, maybe they could write in the comments if they're aware of this case. And what they did in this one particular, they built a rail connection between the impoverished community that was high in crime to the city center. And it allowed for individuals to then go to the city center for employment purposes, where before they were isolated and deprived that connection. And this is the use of environmental design to combat violence. And what they found is simply providing that kind of access to employment centers ended up reducing the violence in that community dramatically. So you could do it through environmental design. You could do it through music programs. You could do it through educational programs. You could do it through giving individuals alternative options to joining gangs. And all of those approaches have been quite effective. So one example I had in terms of the social determinants of crime was that the people who've been exposed to violence in their community, And they did this study, was called the Boston Reentry study. They looked at these kids, all males, who were in prison for violent crimes, and they surveyed them. And they found that 50% of them had been beaten by their parents. 40% of them had witnessed someone being killed in front of them. 40% had seen someone killed right in front of their eyes. 30% had grown up in a family of violence. 16% had been sexually abused. And so what this shows is that crime is often less a byproduct of individuals and more a byproduct of circumstances. So if we want to prevent those males from ending up in prison, the best way to do it is to go into these communities of violence and to try to interrupt that violence and prevent the crimes from occurring in the first place. And successful ways of doing that could be school programs, in-home programs, social, programs and opportunities in a community. Often in New York, they also have a program called interrupters. These are people who were previously served time for gang violence, who then go back to their communities as interrupters. And because they have credence in the community, they were once a member of the gangs. They have an ear to the ground. And so let's say one gang member gets killed. Well, they have a awareness that often that means some retaliation is going to come. And so they are there within the community, not as outsiders, but as members of the community who have some authority and standing within that community, who then try to interrupt the violence before it occurs. And those programs have also been used in South America, and they've been proven to be very, very, very effective. And so there isn't this clear black and white distinction between the criminal and the victim and the offender. In fact, when you look into the lives of people who find themselves in prison, we find lives of hardship. The vast majority, over 90% of the people who find themselves in prison were themselves victimized sometime in the past. And there's a cycle of victimization and then violence. And so the best way to stop that violence from spreading is to interrupt it. And it could be things by designing railways or a system that gets people access to where the jobs are. It could be adding air conditioning facilities on hot days. It could be educational or music programs. And so there are a number of really important pilot studies and programs that have adopted this public health approach. And almost every one of them has found some degree of effectiveness.
Thank you. Here's a question that asking about your role as a father. So if you think as a father that you have a responsibility for the moral formation of your children, are you therefore admitting that there is such a thing as moral choice and moral responsibility?
Well, as I said, there are different kinds of responsibility, not all of which are basic desert responsibility. And so, for example, let me give you one I didn't mention yet, role responsibility. Well, that doesn't depend on free will or basic desert moral responsibility. So you might have the role of organizing this talk or moderating the questions, or I might take on the role of throwing my daughter a birthday party or organizing a conference. That kind of role responsibility comes with certain types of tasks. So someone who takes on that role has the responsibility of scheduling the talk, moderating the questions, or getting the birthday cake, etc. That doesn't presuppose that I'm responsible in the basic desert sense. It just means I'm responsible in that in certain capacities within society, we take on certain roles. The police officer has different role responsibilities than the firefighter or the non-police officer. And I would say as a father, I have a certain role responsibility to help develop my daughter as a moral being. And I don't think morality in the sense of axiological good and bad, right and wrong, is threatened by free will skepticism. So I think that that's consistent as a parent to say that when my child does wrong, I can engage them in some kind of moral conversation. I could point out the wrongness of the act. We could discuss forward-looking ways together that would produce better outcomes in the future. And I should add to this that yes, as a free will skeptic, certain types of reactive attitudes would have to be rejected. That is, I think as a free will skeptic, moral anger is unjustified, or resentment and indignation is problematic. But I also think that those reactive attitudes are often corrosive to our interpersonal relationships, and alternative attitudes would do just as well or better as replacements. So, for example, instead of expressing moral anger, a retributive reaction, let's say, to my daughter's wrongdoing, I express sadness or disappointment. That could have the same effect on my daughter. It might even have a better pedagogical effect. I mean, we often react better to disappointment than we do to moral anger. Um, and so, one example I like to use sometimes is the example of an art critique. So I used to be the chair of my department and included the art faculty. And when, art critiques involve in the classroom, one of the students, puts up their work of art in front of the classroom, and the professor and the other students critique the work. Now, note a couple of things. All of the purpose of this process is forward looking. We want to make this person a better artist. If you were to blame the person for their choices or express, retributive reactions, that's going to have a negative pedagogical effect on the development of that student. Nonetheless, I think we could still ask them why they made the aesthetic choices that they made. You could suggest better choices they could make in the future. You could critique certain aspects of the work. And all of that would have a much better pedagogical effect on the student so that they develop better skills and then alter their behavior, i.e., change their creative process in the future. Now, I would argue the same is true when it comes to morality. It's like you look at the act together, we can point to certain features of the act that are bad, and instead of expressing anger or resentment or some kind of retributive reaction, which again I think could be pedagogically harmful, I express suggestive approaches, reconciliatory approaches, and forward-looking approaches for making better choices in the future. I think all of that is perfectly consistent with rejection of basic desert.
Thank you. And you talked a lot about the positive sides. Had a bunch of questions about the negative sides about retribution. So I'll combine a bunch of them together and ask you a few points. First of all, why does retribution make at least some of us feel good? Can you think of any reason why, for example, conservatives and religious evangelical groups prefer retribution? And how do you address our intuition that without a punishment, a punitive element, people just get away with even heinous crimes?
Oh, yeah. All right. See if I could recall all three. So the first one I would say is I think the retributive reaction is sort of hardwired in us. I mean, maybe evolutionarily speaking, we have this very strong strike back emotion when someone wrongs us, especially in our intimate relations. Um, and evolutionarily speaking, it may have served a really useful function at some point. But it also leads to excessive forms of public policy, and then ends up with the kind of mass incarceration process situation we have when it's implemented on the level of public policy. So I'll say a couple of things. I mean, one is, look, maybe I can never totally eradicate my reactive or my retributive impulse when if someone harmed my daughter or my wife, I don't think I'm not a Buddhist monk. I probably have some kind of retributive impulse. But I can also rationally reflect upon that impulse and realize that it lacks any justificatory force. That is, I shouldn't justify my actual reaction, my actual behavior, or in particular on the level of public policy, we shouldn't base our criminal justice policies on that strike back emotion. And I do think the strike back emotion is kind of natural, but doesn't necessarily mean it's justified. And I do think that there is a certain satisfaction that comes in seeing sometimes others suffer. But again, that is not necessarily means we are justified in making other people suffer. So like, for example, what if a victim thought to themselves, look, you keyed my car. I want to see your hands cut off. And I'm not going to feel satisfied unless I really see your hands cut off. Well, I think even the retributivist would say, well, look, denying that person the satisfaction of, of that, of cutting the guy's hands off, I'm not wronging the victim by denying them that pleasure because, well, it's just a disproportionate reaction to that crime. So I would say even worse, if individuals don't justly deserve to be punished in that way, then again, denying the person the satisfaction of that retributive reaction isn't a violation of their rights. Secondly, okay, so why we have the reaction, why do certain people with religious and political views favor? There is some evidence to that question, by the way. So it does seem to show that the belief in free wills corresponds more with different certain set of conservative beliefs and reactions, and there might be a natural reason as to why. I mean, one is that the ethos of individualism is much stronger on the right than it is on the left. There's more of a belief that individuals can pick themselves up from the bootstraps, that they're somehow a causa sui, self-made, and therefore deserve all the praise and all the blame for where they, when they end up doing good or doing bad. And I'll give you one sociological example of this. There's something called the belief in a just world. And it's been shown that the stronger the belief in free will someone has, the stronger the belief in a just world. And also, the stronger the belief in free will is correlated with a stronger belief in right-wing authoritarianism and certain other conservative beliefs and attitudes. And these are all social phenomena that have scales that can measure them. So we can measure how strong your belief in a just world is, how strong your belief in right-wing authoritarianism is. I'm not making these terms up. These are social psychological terms that have been studied. And so the belief in a just world, well, it looks innocuous on the surface. It's the belief that, well, the world's just, and good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And that belief seems to be stronger on the right, and it seems to be stronger among those who believe in free will. However, I argue that it's a pernicious belief because the belief in a just world ultimately resorts on a blame the victim approach. So I'll give you a very good example of it. Rape victims. Often women who have been victimized have their character impugned during a trial. And the reason the defense attorney will question the woman's character is because it works. And it works in part because people want to preserve the belief that the world is just. Now, rape is a horrific thing. How could such a horrific thing happen to someone who didn't deserve it? And it's an unconscious desire to preserve the belief that the world is just, because we want to preserve the belief that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. But to preserve that belief unconsciously, we somehow make the victim deserving. We say things like, well, they were dressed provocatively, or they were walking where they shouldn't be walking, or they were intoxicated, or they brought it upon themselves. And that's because to preserve the belief that when bad things happen, they happen because the person deserves it. And when good things happen, they happen because the person deserves it. To do that, you end up ultimately blaming victims. You end up blaming the rape victim for her own victimhood. You end up blaming the person in poverty for being in poverty. And that's often more true on those who believe in a just world and those who believe in right-wing authoritarianism and those who believe in free will. So the person who is in poverty or in the ghetto deserves to be in the ghetto because, well, if they just worked hard, they could get out of it. If they just, if they deserved it, they would. And somehow they must deserve this. Or the child who lacks educational equity somehow deserves, the situation, that they're in. And the same is true for people who find themselves incarcerated. Somehow they must deserve it because they're incarcerated and they did wrong. But that ultimately ends up effectively preventing us from looking beyond the level of individual responsibility and blinds us to the systemic causes. And I'll give you one more example of this. Some of you may remember this. President Obama gave this really famous speech that really triggered something on the right. He said in front of a very successful business crowd that, hey, look, if you succeeded in business, you didn't build it yourself. I think that was the line that was taken out of context. You didn't build it yourself. And it was a presidential election year, and that year the Republican National Committee spent the whole Republican convention based around the slogan, "Yes, we did." That was the slogan that year. Yes, we did. Yes, we built it ourselves. And the reason they opposed that claim so strongly was that it seemed to undermine this notion of being able to, own it yourself, own your success, just like blaming people for not succeeding. Now, if anyone knows what Obama said next, it was a completely innocuous statement. He said, look, if you succeeded, you didn't build it yourself. And then the next sentence was, well, you probably had an encouraging teacher or a supportive parent along the way, or some help from a loved one. You probably delivered your goods on highways built by, taxpayers, et cetera, et cetera. The idea is that, it's really a matter of luck. The luck aspect is a really big one. And I think those that have a strong belief in free will and a strong belief in a just world want to diminish the role of luck. And yet, the lottery of life is not always fair. We don't all have equal starting points. And some people have more hurdles placed in front of them than others. And not because they deserve it or not because they earned it, but because of pure luck. Like I didn't earn or whiteness or maleness, and yet I get certain advantages in society by being white and male, and yet I don't think that's a matter of desert. It's a matter of luck, and an unfair one for people who aren't white and male, right? So it's a matter of luck whether you're born into a wealthy family or a poor family, into a community of violence or a community where there isn't as much violence. It's a matter of luck whether you have an abusive parent or a supportive parent. It's a matter of luck whether your first grade music teacher inspired you. It's a matter of luck as to whether or not there was a teacher who took you under their wing somewhere along the way, or a coach that really encouraged you. And those features of luck are things that we don't ultimately control, yet they create what I call our constitutive character. And that's what is called constitutive luck. And so I think there's a long answer, but I think it's an important one to that question, is that those on the right tend to want to downplay that luck feature, want to play up the individual responsibility part, and they often tie that to the belief in a just world. And so it ends up with a much more individualized approach and a much more blame-based and retributive approach. And by the way, it goes back to Ronald Reagan. There's a quote I have in my book from Ronald Reagan where it was before he was president, even before he was governor of California, where in the tough on crime movement, remember, he's one of the people that really drove the mass incarceration crisis, and partly because he had this ethos of individual responsibility. And the quote was something like, we have to stop thinking that every time a crime occurs, it's society's fault, and we have to return to the ethos of individual responsibility. Now, there's aspects of that quote you might agree with, but there's also an aspect of that quote that directly contributes to the kind of problematic policies that I talked about earlier, which is that keeping a myopic focus on individual responsibility blinds us to the policies and the funding of those policies that would effectively identify, target, and address the social determinants of crime. And if your ethos is one of individual responsibility, you're less likely to fund those programs.
Thank you. Well, we're running near to the end of our time. So thanks again to Gregg for a very informative presentation. And thank you for all the thoughtful questions from participants. Sorry that we didn't have time for everyone's question. If you'd like more information about Gregg's books and other work, you can visit his website at greggcaruso.com, and also post that in the comments. And I just have a few closing remarks before we go. First, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to some of our upcoming events. On March 10th, for example, we have a talk on ethical issues in police conduct. On March 20th, we have a talk on sustainable design called Saving the World One Tire at a Time. We also have an online conference planned for May. Please check us out on Meetup, Facebook, or the CFIC website for more information about our upcoming events. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're Canada's only national nonprofit for scientific inquiry and secular community. We hope those of you who are not already members will consider purchasing a membership. We'll include a link to our membership page in the chat window, and you can also find it through Meetup. We ask you to please consider a membership at only $30 a year. I'd also like to thank all the CFIC volunteers who help with this and other events. If you'd like to volunteer with CFIC, you can sign up on our website. Once again, I'd like to thank Gregg for being our speaker. And since Zoom does not do well with audible clapping, I invite you to express your appreciation. If you go to the reactions icon, you can find select more and you can find a clap, and then we can do a visual clap.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone.